As the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks of the mountains, casting long shadows over the sprawling wilderness, Marcus Steele pulled into the parking lot of the park ranger station. The air was thick with the smell of pine and fresh earth, a scent so pure it almost felt like a balm to his tired soul. He let out a breath, letting the cool, crisp air fill his lungs as he shut off the engine of his truck. His hands, worn from years of combat and sleepless nights, were stiff on the steering wheel. It had taken 2 days to drive from Denver, his old life a distant blur with every mile that stretched between him and the city. The road had been long, but as he gazed out over the expansive vista of the national park, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: peace. A peace that seemed so foreign, so fragile, yet it was the very thing he needed. Marcus wasn't here for a vacation. He wasn't here for the views, though they were certainly stunning. He had come here to escape, to shed the burden of the memories that still haunted him, the ones that followed him back from the war. The PTSD that weighed heavily on his chest like an anchor, pulling him down in the midst of crowded cities and chaotic streets. The constant noise, the sirens, the people always moving too fast, everything that reminded him of the battlefields he had walked away from but never truly left behind. The park seemed so different, almost too still, too quiet. Here, in the vastness of nature, Marcus could pretend that the noise of his past didn't exist. He grabbed the small duffel bag from the passenger seat, his boots crunching the gravel as he made his way to the ranger station. A small, modest building made of stone. It looked as though it had stood there for generations, blending into the landscape like it had always been a part of the mountains. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed above, casting a sterile glow over the old wooden benches and worn posters of wildlife pinned to the walls. Marcus walked in, his boots leaving quiet echoes on the tile floor, his presence an intrusion in this quiet place that seemed so far removed from the world he had known. Behind the counter stood a woman, perhaps in her late 40s, with sharp eyes that had the look of someone who had spent more time outdoors than in. Her auburn hair was pulled back into a practical ponytail, and her park service uniform was neat and pressed, but her hands, calloused and weathered, told a different story. She was the type of woman who had lived in the field, braving the harsh elements and long hours in the wild. "Can I help you?" she asked as Marcus approached the counter, her voice steady and professional, though there was a warmth there that softened her commanding presence. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Marcus Steele, reporting for duty," he replied, his voice low, the years of military training still resonating in his tone. He had a clean shave, his hair cut short and neat, just the kind of appearance that said, "I follow orders and I don't make waves." She looked him over for a brief moment before extending a firm handshake. "Summer Bailey, you're the new ranger assigned to the Lamar Valley, right?" Her handshake was solid, businesslike, and while there was a friendliness there, it was clear she was no stranger to this kind of work. Her eyes seemed to see straight through him, assessing him in an instant. "That's right." Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of the job settling on his shoulders. "It's a long drive, 2 days from Denver. I'm just here to start fresh, I suppose," she interrupted, her gaze never leaving his as she shuffled through a stack of paperwork. "A lot of us come here for that reason." She handed him a manila folder, its contents neatly organized but unremarkable. "You'll find everything you need here. Standard employment forms, emergency contacts, and the park protocols." He took the folder, his eyes skimming over the documents. He'd expected the usual forms, the things all new hires had to fill out. But then, Summer slid a separate piece of paper across the counter, its stark white surface almost too bright against the dim, artificial light of the station. She didn't say anything as he picked it up, but the moment his eyes locked on the sheet, his pulse quickened. The list was typed in a Spartan, no-nonsense font. Courier, 6 rules, each one more bizarre than the last. Don't make eye contact with a bear if it's walking backwards, he read aloud, unable to mask the confusion in his voice. Follow them exactly as written, Summer said, her tone unwavering. She didn't flinch, didn't crack a smile or offer any sort of clarification. Is this a joke? He asked, looking up from the sheet, but Summer's face remained expressionless. Her gaze was steady, almost expectant. These protocols are in place for a reason. They've been honed over years of experience in the park. It's important you follow them. No exceptions. If you have questions, ask later, but for now, just know that they are not negotiable. Marcus frowned, trying to make sense of what he was reading. If I hear a child crying in the wilderness, I'm not supposed to investigate. He muttered, disbelief creeping into his voice. No, Summer replied flatly. You don't investigate. The same goes for the wolves. If you hear 3 howls in sequence, you barricade yourself inside the nearest station. Trust the protocols. Marcus was taken aback, his military-trained mind spinning through the logic, or lack thereof, behind the rules. This wasn't a normal work environment. This wasn't standard Park Service protocol, but he had made a decision. This was his chance to start over, to leave behind the shadows of his past. His mind was made up. He needed this job more than anything. So, despite the confusion gnawing at him, he nodded in agreement. Understood, he said, his voice more certain now. Follow the rules, no questions. Summer handed him a set of keys, her face remaining unchanged. You'll be assigned Unit 12, a white Ford Explorer. Start with the Lamar Valley route. Familiarize yourself with the terrain. You've got the rest of the day to get oriented. He took the keys, their cold metal weight grounding him in the moment. The mundane detail of getting a car felt like a small victory after the strange introduction. It was an anchor, a symbol of something real and stable amidst the surreal nature of his first day. The next morning, Marcus woke up to the faint light of dawn filtering through the thin curtains of his small, government-issued studio apartment. The quiet of the park, so stark compared to the noise of the outside world, wrapped itself around him, making the world feel oddly still. He had spent years on the move, on the battlefield, in the cities. His mind always alert, his body always ready. Now, in this remote corner of the country, the silence was both soothing and unsettling. After a quick breakfast of black coffee and a granola bar, Marcus made his way to the ranger station. The air was crisp, the scent of the forest fresh and piney, but there was something about the quiet that gnawed at him, something he couldn't quite shake. When he arrived at the station, Summer was already there, waiting for him behind the counter. Her stern but welcoming expression didn't waver as she handed him a thick packet of paperwork. She seemed to know exactly what to do, moving with a purpose, her every action deliberate and controlled. "Ready for your first day?" she asked, her voice steady as always. "Yeah, ready," Marcus replied, though the edge of skepticism lingered in his voice. He had spent his entire life following orders, but something about this place, the rules, the isolation, felt different. "Good," Summer said, pulling a sheet of paper from the stack and sliding it across the counter to him. "Here are your local protocols. Every ranger in this park follows them. It's crucial to stick to these rules. You'll see why soon enough." Marcus took the paper, his fingers tracing over the smooth surface. He glanced at the first line. 1. If you encounter a bear walking backward, do not make eye contact. Continue your patrol route without stopping or alerting dispatch. Marcus froze for a second, his eyes scanning the strange words. What? He muttered under his breath. He looked up at Summer for clarification, but her face remained unreadable. Correct, she replied, not missing a beat. Don't make eye contact with a bear if it's walking backwards. Just follow the protocol. He blinked a few times, struggling to understand. Was this some kind of joke? He had been given strange assignments in the military, unconventional operations, complex and confusing. But this didn't make sense. He scanned the rest of the sheet, hoping it would offer some sort of logical explanation. But as he read, the absurdity of it all grew. 2. If you hear a child crying in the wilderness, do not investigate under any circumstances. 3. You must complete all patrols exactly 2 hours after sunset, regardless of weather or other conditions. 4. If you hear 3 distinct wolf howls in sequence, barricade yourself in the nearest station until sunrise. 5. If you encounter 3 or more people sitting together outdoors, drive away immediately without stopping. 6. Do not engage in any interaction with after-hours visitors who ask for information about the park. Offer water but do not answer their questions. Marcus felt his stomach tighten as he reread the list. His military training had taught him to follow orders without question, to think on his feet, and to make split-second decisions. But this was different. These were rules that didn't make sense. Rules that felt less like protocol and more like a game, or worse, a trap. He lifted his gaze from the paper, his voice laced with disbelief. Summer, I gotta ask, are these real rules? Are these actually enforced? Summer's face didn't change, her expression as steady as ever. Yes, these rules have been followed for years. Trust them, Marcus. It may seem strange, but you'll understand once you start working here. She paused for a moment, her eyes meeting his with a seriousness that was hard to ignore. In this park, we follow the protocols. They're not optional. These rules were created for a reason. Marcus felt a knot form in his chest. He was used to strange orders, but these were different. The military had taught him to trust his instincts, but right now his instincts were screaming that something was off. Still, he didn't want to rock the boat on his first day. He had come here to escape his past, to find peace in the wilderness. The last thing he needed was to start questioning everything. Understood, he said, nodding. I'll follow the protocols. But his voice didn't carry the confidence it usually did. There was a thread of doubt weaving through his words. Summer handed him a set of keys for the patrol vehicle. Your first assignment is to patrol the Lamar Valley route. It's one of the more remote areas of the park, perfect for getting familiar with the landscape. Stick to the route. No deviations. I'll check in with you later. He took the keys, the cold metal pressing against his palm. Thanks, he said, his voice flat. As he turned to leave, Summer's voice stopped him. One more thing. Don't break protocol. Trust me, Marcus. The rules are there for your safety. There's more to this place than meets the eye. Marcus climbed into the white Ford Explorer that had been assigned to him, the familiar hum of the engine soothing him for a moment. As he drove through the winding roads of the Lamar Valley, the vastness of the park stretched out before him. Rolling hills and tall, wind-whipped grasses framed his view, while distant mountain peaks loomed in the horizon. The landscape was breathtaking, so different from the noise and chaos of the city, so pure and untouched. But the silence felt heavy. It wasn't the peaceful quiet he had been hoping for. No, this silence felt controlled. Everything about the park felt too perfect, too pristine, as if it were a set in a movie. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced down at the list of rules in the passenger seat. If you encounter a bear walking backward, the words blurred for a second as he tried to wrap his mind around them. He knew that animals in Yellowstone could be unpredictable, but backward-walking bears, that was something he had never heard of. Maybe he was just overthinking it. Maybe the isolation of the park was starting to get to him. The radio crackled to life, breaking the silence. Unit 12, radio check. A voice said. Unit 12 operational. Marcus replied, trying to sound confident. Copy that. He continued driving, passing through winding trails that led deeper into the valley. The radio chatter was sporadic, and he felt his unease grow with each passing mile. He had expected to be alone out here, but the quiet was unsettling. As he made a turn onto a new section of the route, he spotted something out of the corner of his eye, movement in the distance. He slowed the vehicle, squinting against the sunlight. There, on the far edge of the field, was a bear. It was walking in a strange, almost unnatural way, its back to him. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. The bear was walking backward. His mind raced. This couldn't be real. This had to be a trick of the light. Bears didn't walk backward. But then the bear's movements were too deliberate, too coordinated to be accidental. His pulse quickened and his fingers tightened around the steering wheel. The rules flashed in his mind. If you encounter a bear walking backward, do not make eye contact. He fought the urge to look directly at the bear. His instincts told him to stop, to pull over and observe it. But the rules were clear. He couldn't make eye contact. He couldn't break the protocol. With a deep breath, he forced himself to look away, focusing on the road ahead. The bear continued to move in a slow, calculated manner, its back to him, never turning its head. Something about the way it moved felt wrong, like it was aware of him, aware of the vehicle. As the road curved, the bear disappeared from view. Marcus looked in his rearview mirror, but there was nothing there. Just trees and the empty expanse of the valley. He let out a shaky breath and pressed on the gas, the weight of the strange encounter hanging in the air. The day had started like any other. The sun was high, casting long, lazy shadows over the pristine wilderness of Yellowstone. Marcus had been patrolling for hours, his white Ford Explorer the only sign of human presence in the vast stretch of untouched land. The scenery was beautiful, rolling hills, valleys covered in wildflowers, the distant peaks of the Rockies rising against a sky so blue it almost seemed surreal. But the more he drove, the more the isolation gnawed at him. He hadn't seen another person for miles, and while the silence was peaceful, it also felt suffocating. The radio crackled intermittently, offering a few bursts of static and the occasional check-in from other rangers. The sound was comforting in its normality, but it only reminded him of the strange rules he had been handed just the day before. His thoughts kept drifting back to the bear, the backward-walking bear, and the peculiar set of protocols that seemed to govern every move he made. Was this just some kind of bureaucratic oddity? Or was there something more sinister happening here, something that he was only beginning to understand? The radio crackled again. It was another ranger, but the message was unintelligible, drowned out by static. He clicked the channel dial, trying to clear it up, but before he could adjust the settings, something caught his eye. Through the windshield, on the edge of a dense grove of trees, Marcus saw movement. At first, it was nothing more than a flicker, a shadow shifting in the corner of his vision. But as he slowed the vehicle and turned his head, the figure became clearer. A massive bear, its dark brown fur contrasting against the green of the forest. Marcus's heart rate kicked up as he instinctively reached for the steering wheel, tightening his grip. He had seen his fair share of bears in the wild, both during his military service and his time spent in the wilderness. Bears were a regular part of park life, but what he saw now didn't feel like the typical bear encounter. This bear wasn't just walking. It was moving backward. The creature's hind legs worked in an unnatural manner, digging into the earth like it was stepping carefully, calculating each movement. The bear's front paws were outstretched, searching for ground, its face turned away from Marcus's direction. It was a slow, deliberate motion, almost as if the bear was walking in reverse, not out of necessity, but because it had chosen to. Marcus's breath hitched. His mind screamed at him to stop, to pull over and observe, to make sure it wasn't just a trick of the light. But his training, and the rules Summer had laid out for him, held him back. He couldn't break protocol. He couldn't make eye contact with the bear. He forced his eyes away from the creature, locking his gaze on the road ahead. His knuckles went white as he gripped the steering wheel harder, trying to calm the sudden rush of adrenaline in his veins. The image of the bear stayed in his peripheral vision, but he refused to look back. His mind was racing. What was going on? Bears didn't do this. They didn't walk backward. Was he imagining it? Was this just the isolation of the park playing tricks on him, or was there something supernatural at work here? His military instincts told him to turn around, to engage, to investigate further. But he couldn't. The protocol was clear. If you encounter a bear walking backward, do not make eye contact. The words from Summer echoed in his head, each one sharp and uncompromising. The air felt heavy with the weight of the rule, almost suffocating him. Marcus kept driving, forcing his mind to focus on the task at hand, the patrol, the route. His job, everything was supposed to be normal, just another day in the park with the same familiar routine. But the bear, its strange behavior, kept haunting him. His fingers twitched as he reached for the radio. He wanted to report the encounter, but he stopped himself. What would he say? "Hey, dispatch, I saw a bear walking backward. Is that normal?" The thought sounded ridiculous, even to him. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears as he drove on, his eyes flicking nervously to the rearview mirror. The bear was still there in the distance, but it was slowly fading from view. Still, its presence lingered in his mind, the strange sight of it walking backward becoming more and more unsettling as the minutes passed. Minutes turned into an hour, and the strange encounter with the bear began to feel like a distant memory, almost as though it had never happened. But as Marcus continued on the Lamar Valley route, the silence began to feel oppressive once more. The wilderness, which had first seemed so welcoming, now felt like a cage. The stillness was too absolute, too unnatural. He passed a few scattered bison grazing lazily by the side of the road, a group of elk near a distant tree line. They were all part of the usual scenery, but none of them could shake the tension that had settled in his chest. As he rounded another bend, a sudden thought occurred to him. What if the bear wasn't the only strange thing in this park? What if it wasn't just the animals acting weird? What if the people, his fellow rangers, were part of something that he wasn't meant to understand? Summer had warned him. "These rules are here for a reason," she'd said, her tone serious, her gaze unflinching. Was it possible that the entire park was part of some twisted experiment? some controlled environment where even the wildlife had been manipulated to create a specific reaction. His military mind began to work overtime, piecing together the pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit. He thought back to the strange rules he had been given: the crying child, the wolf howls, the three people sitting together outdoors. They weren't just quirky regulations. They were precise, specific, carefully crafted to guide his actions, his reactions. But to what end? Was he the one being tested? As he drove on, the sense of dread began to build, slow and insidious, like a storm gathering on the horizon. Marcus had learned how to survive under extreme pressure, how to trust his instincts, but here, in the vast emptiness of Yellowstone, those instincts were telling him that something wasn't right. Something was off. The way the bear had moved, the strange protocols, the quietness of the park, it all felt like he was walking on the edge of something far more sinister than he had imagined. The wilderness stretched out before him, serene and beautiful on the surface, but it felt like it was hiding something beneath its calm exterior. It felt like a place where rules had been created for reasons that no one dared to explain. And he was caught in the middle of it, a pawn in a game he didn't understand. The afternoon wore on, and the sky slowly shifted from its bright midday blue to the deepening hues of early evening. The park was still and quiet, the only sounds the occasional call of a distant bird or the rustling of wind through the trees. Marcus drove along the winding roads of the Lamar Valley, the engine humming softly beneath him, his eyes scanning the vast expanse of wilderness. Everything seemed normal, almost too normal. The bison were grazing lazily by the roadside. The elk moved slowly across the grasslands, and the occasional osprey flapped overhead. Yet the sense of unease that had started to creep in the day before had grown stronger, more palpable. The bear's strange backward walking lingered in his thoughts, and now, as he drove deeper into the park, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something was watching him. It was when he passed through a stretch of dense forest that the silence was shattered. A faint, desperate cry pierced the stillness of the wilderness. It was the unmistakable sound of a child crying, sharp, frantic, and filled with fear. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. He slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding slightly on the gravel road. His eyes darted around, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. There, through the trees on the right, he thought he saw movement. Without thinking, his hand reached for the radio, intending to report the cry. But as his fingers brushed the radio dial, he remembered the rules, the unspoken weight of Summer's words from earlier. If you hear a child crying in the wilderness, do not investigate under any circumstances. His hand froze above the radio. Marcus's breath hitched as the crying grew louder, more frantic, more desperate. The sound of a child in distress was one of the most gut-wrenching things he had ever experienced, and it struck a chord deep within him. His instincts as a soldier, as a protector, told him to act, to jump out of the truck and find the child, help them, protect them. But the rules were clear. He couldn't investigate. He had no choice but to drive away. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, but all he saw was the same expanse of trees and open land. The crying continued, echoing in his mind as if following him. He glanced once more to the side, but there was no sign of movement, just the dark, looming forest. The child's cries echoed in his ears, gnawing at him, as he put the truck in gear and slowly pressed the accelerator. The tires rolled over the gravel road, the sound of the engine filling the empty space left by the child's distress. As he drove, his mind raced. How could he just leave a child behind? His military training, the way it had drilled into him to never leave anyone behind, screamed in opposition to the rules. He had been trained to protect, to help, to never abandon someone in need. And yet he followed the protocol. The radio crackled again, breaking the oppressive silence. Unit 12, radio check. A voice called, and Marcus barely heard it over the sound of his own heartbeat. His fingers hovered over the radio dial again, but he didn't respond. He couldn't bring himself to say anything. The minutes dragged on, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The sound of the crying child was still in his head, despite the fact that he was miles away from where it had originated. It was almost like an echo reverberating through his thoughts. He glanced at his rearview mirror again. The road behind him stretched empty just as it should, but something caught his eye. A figure, small and moving fast. Marcus squinted, his gaze fixed on the mirror. The child, the one who had been crying, was running along the road. He could see her now, just behind his vehicle. His stomach twisted into a knot. She was moving at an impossible speed, her legs pumping in perfect rhythm as she kept pace with the truck. Impossible. The child was running at a speed that no normal human could keep up with. She was just a blur of motion, her arms pumping with unnatural precision, her face, her eyes too focused, too determined. Marcus's foot hit the gas pedal harder. He increased speed, but the child's pace never faltered. She stayed right behind him, matching his every move. He glanced at the speedometer, 30 miles per hour, then 40. And still the child was with him, running effortlessly as if this were nothing more than a casual jog. His heart raced. He couldn't process what he was seeing. How was she keeping up? This was no ordinary child. This wasn't a normal situation. Something was happening, something that couldn't be explained by the natural world, by biology or physics. The child's face twisted in a smile. Not a child's innocent smile, but something wrong. It was too wide, too unnerving. Her eyes were locked on his vehicle, and she seemed to be watching him, watching his every move with an eerie sense of calm. Marcus's skin crawled. The road curved ahead, and for a moment Marcus lost sight of the child in his rearview mirror. He allowed himself a brief moment of relief. Maybe it had just been his mind playing tricks on him. Maybe he had been too caught up in the moment, in the stress of the job, of the isolation. But then, as if by fate, she was there again. When he glanced into the mirror, she was directly behind him, running with the same unnatural ease. And this time her eyes were not just watching him, they were staring directly at him through the rearview mirror. It was as if she knew he was looking. Her gaze was fixed, her expression unsettlingly calm. Marcus's throat tightened, his heart pounded. He couldn't do this. He couldn't be the person who ignored what was right in front of him. His instincts screamed at him to stop the truck, to open the door and help the child, to bring her inside where it was safe. But the rules, the damn rules. Do not investigate. Marcus forced himself to keep driving, his eyes locked on the road ahead, refusing to look at her any longer. He could feel the weight of her gaze, like fingers pressing into his back, watching, waiting. His fingers twitched at the steering wheel, his mind a blur of confusion, fear, and disbelief. He had followed the rules. He had obeyed them, but it felt wrong. Deep down, it felt wrong. And yet, despite everything, despite the overwhelming need to stop and help her, he kept driving. His foot stayed firmly on the accelerator, his eyes ahead. But the child was still there, running behind him, following him. As Marcus continued on the patrol route, his thoughts were a chaotic swirl of uncertainty and fear. He had followed the protocol. He had done exactly what he was told to do. But everything about this situation felt wrong. His military instincts, honed over years of training, told him that he couldn't just drive away. He couldn't leave a child in danger. But here he was, alone in the vastness of the park, following the rules to the letter. And yet, something in the pit of his stomach told him that the rules were not enough to keep him safe. The child had disappeared from his mirror once again, but the uneasy feeling remained. His mind raced with questions, each one more disturbing than the last. Was this some sort of psychological test designed to push him past his limits? Or was there something else happening in this park, something darker and more sinister than he could have ever imagined? He could feel the weight of the protocols, heavy like chains around his chest. The further he drove, the more trapped he felt. It wasn't just the wilderness surrounding him. It was the rules, the strange, inexplicable things he had witnessed. It was the overwhelming sense that something was very wrong. And the worst part, he still didn't know what was going on. The days blended together in a strange haze. After the unsettling encounter with the child, Marcus felt like he was walking through a fog, his every step weighed down by the growing sense that something was wrong, deeply wrong, at Yellowstone. The eerie rules were no longer just oddities on paper. They were manifesting in the strangest ways, creeping into his thoughts and dreams, leaving him questioning everything. The more he tried to push the unsettling experiences aside and focus on his patrols, the more they seemed to follow him, haunting him in the quiet moments between the radio crackles and the rustling of leaves. The bear walking backward, the child running with impossible speed. It was as though the park itself was bending reality, forcing him to play by rules that didn't make sense. One morning, Marcus decided to take matters into his own hands. The eerie silence and the weight of the rules were becoming unbearable, and he couldn't keep ignoring the questions that gnawed at him. It wasn't just about the rules anymore. It was about uncovering the truth, what was really happening at Yellowstone. He began his investigation quietly, seeking out old records and hidden files at the ranger station. Summer had been too tight-lipped, and the younger rangers seemed as clueless as he was. But there had to be someone who knew something, someone who had been around long enough to see the patterns, to know the history of the park. The small, cluttered office in the back of the ranger station held shelves of dusty old files and outdated manuals. It smelled of old paper and ink, a musty, comforting scent that made Marcus feel like he was stepping into another time. He pulled out a few manila folders at random, flipping through them to see if they offered any clues. Most were filled with routine maintenance reports, wildlife observations, and standard park procedures. Nothing out of the ordinary. But then, in the back of one particularly thick file, he found something different. A series of reports, each written by former rangers. They all seemed to detail strange incidents, encounters with wildlife that didn't behave like wildlife, unexplained occurrences in the park that were never fully investigated. Each report was accompanied by a simple note, transferred to another district. No further questions allowed. Marcus's stomach twisted as he skimmed through the pages. These weren't just minor incidents. These were serious events. Rangers who had witnessed things that defied explanation. Things that had no place in the world of nature reserves. Yet, there were no follow-up investigations, no public record. It was as though these reports had been quietly swept under the rug, erased from history. He pulled out one report in particular, dated nearly 10 years ago. It detailed an encounter with a wolf pack that seemed to exhibit strange, coordinated behavior. The ranger who wrote the report described how he had been forced to barricade himself inside the station after hearing the howls, but there was something else, something unsettling about the timing of the howls, the way they seemed to echo in unison, as though they were communicating in a way that no wolf pack had ever been known to do. The note at the bottom of the report was clear. Ranger Smith has been reassigned. Case closed. Marcus's heart sank. This wasn't just strange park policy. This was something far more sinister, something that involved manipulating the rangers themselves, using them as subjects in some twisted experiment. The rules weren't about protecting the park. They were about controlling the people in it, forcing them to follow instructions without question. By the end of the week, Marcus had spent every spare moment combing through old records, piecing together the fragments of history that had been hidden from him. It was clear now. This wasn't just strange policy. This was part of a much deeper conspiracy, one that had been unfolding for decades. But it wasn't until he ran into Steve Norwood, the older ranger who had been with Yellowstone for over 30 years, that he started to uncover the full extent of what was going on. Steve was sitting on a bench outside the ranger station when Marcus approached him. His weathered face seemed to sag under the weight of years spent in the wild, but his eyes were sharp, full of quiet wisdom. He had always been a bit of an enigma, a man who kept to himself, who rarely spoke about the past. But Marcus had a feeling that Steve knew something important. "Morning, Steve," Marcus said, taking a seat next to him. "You got a minute?" Steve didn't answer immediately. He just stared out across the valley, his weathered hands resting on his knees. Finally, he turned to Marcus, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What's got you so restless, kid?" Marcus hesitated for a moment, wondering how to ask the question that had been burning in his mind. "I've been looking into the history of the park," he began slowly. "Some of the older reports from rangers who were here before me. I've been hearing strange things about the rules, about what's really going on here." Steve's expression darkened. He sat up straighter, his gaze shifting away from Marcus as if he were weighing something heavy in his mind. "Some things are better left untouched," Steve said quietly, his voice low. "You're not the first ranger to notice. You won't be the last either." Marcus leaned forward, his voice urgent. "What do you mean? What's going on here, Steve? Why are these rules so strange? Why do they make us follow them?" Steve let out a sigh, his eyes clouded with a mix of resignation and fear. "The park has a history, Marcus. A history that no one talks about. Those rules, they aren't there for protection. They're there to control us, to keep us from asking questions, to keep us in line. You think it's just about protecting the park from wildlife? Hell no, it's about controlling what happens in the park. And you're being watched, kid, we all are." Marcus's heart pounded in his chest. Watched by who? Steve looked around nervously, his voice dropping to a whisper. "By them. The people who run this place, the ones who have been here for years. They're studying us, Marcus, testing us. You think the rules are just a formality? No, they're a damn experiment. You follow them and you don't question. If you do, you get reassigned, or worse." Marcus sat back, stunned into silence. Steve wasn't finished. "You're not the first one to question it, you won't be the last, but trust me, you don't want to dig too deep. Some of us have been here too long. We've seen the signs, we know the game they are playing, and you don't want to be the one who starts asking too many questions." The weight of Steve's words settled heavily on Marcus. This wasn't just about following strange park rules anymore. This was something bigger, something darker. As Marcus left Steve, his thoughts raced. He couldn't shake the feeling that the old ranger knew more than he was willing to say, that there was a part of this park's history that was buried, something too dangerous to be uncovered. But Marcus couldn't stop himself. He needed to know. Every fiber of his being told him that this was no ordinary park. This was a place where rules weren't just made. They were imposed for a reason. And Marcus had just scratched the surface of what that reason was. He had to get to the bottom of it. For his own sanity, and for the rangers who had disappeared into the system, quietly reassigned or quietly silenced. It was just past noon when Marcus hit the winding trail of the Lamar Valley again. The morning patrol had been uneventful, the stillness of the park offering him little more than the routine tasks of checking off points on his route and scanning for wildlife. He had tried to push the thoughts of the strange bear, the unnerving encounter with the child, and Steve's cryptic warning out of his mind. But as much as he wanted to, he couldn't escape the growing sense that something was wrong. Everything about this park felt orchestrated. The rules, the reports he had found, and now, the way the animals behaved, unpredictably, unnaturally. This wasn't just a wildlife reserve. It felt like a carefully managed experiment, one with far more at stake than park preservation. As he turned a corner on the trail, he was hit with the sense that something was watching him. It wasn't the usual feeling of solitude that had initially comforted him when he first arrived. This was different, darker, more oppressive. The hair on the back of his neck prickled, a sensation so acute he had to fight the instinct to look over his shoulder, and then he saw it. A large shape moving slowly through the trees just beyond the edge of the trail. It was the same bear from before, the one that had walked backward. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest as he slowed the truck and pulled off to the side of the trail. His breath caught in his throat. The bear was back. But this time, there was something different. The bear was walking backward again, its hind legs pushing against the earth, its front paws feeling for the ground behind it. But it wasn't just moving aimlessly. It was deliberate, methodical, and its head was slightly turned, eyes locked on Marcus's vehicle. The hair on his arm stood on end. It was as if the bear knew exactly where he was and was watching him. No longer just an oddity of animal behavior, the creature now seemed intelligent, aware. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. He knew he shouldn't stop. He knew the protocol. If you encounter a bear walking backward, do not make eye contact. Continue your patrol route without stopping or alerting dispatch. But this wasn't just any bear. This was the same one he had seen days ago. The same strange movement. The same unsettling feeling of being watched. His fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly as he forced himself not to look directly at the bear. But he could still see it, the way it moved with uncanny precision, never straying from its backward path. Every muscle in his body screamed for him to turn around, to flee, but the rules, those damn rules, held him in place. He forced his gaze forward, trying to ignore the weight of the creature's eyes bearing down on him, trying to push aside the feeling that this was more than just an animal acting oddly. The way it moved, backward like it was waiting for him, watching him, it didn't feel like natural animal behavior anymore. It felt orchestrated. Marcus's mind raced. Was this all part of the experiment? The bear's movements were too deliberate, too precise. And the rules, they were becoming clearer to him now, like pieces of a puzzle slowly starting to come together. The strange behaviors of the wildlife, the eerie rules about not engaging with the child, the wolf howls, the people sitting on benches in perfect stillness. It was all connected. But what was the connection? As the bear moved out of his view, disappearing into the trees with its backward, deliberate walk, Marcus couldn't shake the sense that something much bigger was at play, something more sinister than just a few odd park rules. The more he thought about it, the more the pieces of his theory began to fit together. He had been trained to notice patterns, to detect when things didn't make sense. And this whole park, the rules, the animals' strange behaviors, was starting to make less sense with every passing day. What if the animals weren't just behaving erratically because of some natural anomaly? What if they were part of the experiment too? What if the park was being used as a controlled environment where the wildlife was manipulated, controlled, or even studied? The rules weren't just about safety, they were about observation. What if the rangers, including Marcus, were being tested as much as the wildlife? What if they were the real experiment, with the park acting as a sort of laboratory, and every odd event, every strange encounter, was a carefully placed test to measure their reactions, their fear responses, their instincts? The more Marcus thought about it, the more everything began to line up. The protocols made sense now. Don't engage, don't investigate, don't interfere. The park wasn't about protecting the wilderness. It was about controlling the environment. The wildlife, the rangers, and everything in between were part of a carefully constructed scenario designed to test psychological resilience, fear responses, and compliance. And the backward walking bear, wasn't an anomaly. It was part of the experiment. The animals were part of the psychological manipulation, trained or conditioned to behave in ways that pushed the rangers to the edge, to test how far they could be pushed before they cracked. Marcus's stomach twisted as his theory began to form, but the more he pieced together, the darker it became. If the wildlife was being manipulated, if the park was being used for some twisted psychological experiment, then there was no telling what kind of forces were behind it. The park staff, the rangers, the people Marcus had trusted, were they all part of it? Were they the ones controlling the animals, or were they just as much puppets in this strange game? And what about Summer, who had given him the protocols? Had she known about the experiment? Was she complicit, or was she just another pawn in this twisted scheme? He had to know the truth. He had to find out who was behind it all. This wasn't just about strange park rules anymore. This was about something much deeper, something far darker than he had ever imagined. And the more he thought about it, the more the rules, the ones he had been following without question, began to feel like chains, keeping him in place, preventing him from uncovering the truth. The bear was gone now, but the sense of unease lingered in Marcus's chest. He couldn't ignore what he had just witnessed. He couldn't pretend like everything was fine. The pieces were fitting together, but the puzzle was too big, too complex. He needed answers. Marcus turned the truck around, heading back toward the station. The park felt bigger now, more isolating, more controlled. The mystery was growing, and he couldn't deny it any longer. This wasn't just about the rules. It wasn't just about the strange bear, or the crying child, or the people sitting in perfect stillness. It was about something much darker, something that had been hidden in plain sight all along. And Marcus was determined to uncover it, no matter the cost. It was late when Marcus returned to the station after finishing his patrol. The air had cooled significantly, the mountains casting long shadows across the parking lot as he parked his truck and stepped out into the stillness of the night. The usual hum of the park was absent, no tourists, no wildlife sounds, just the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Everything was quiet, almost too quiet. It was the kind of quiet that made you feel like you were being watched, even when you were alone. His footsteps echoed in the empty hall as he entered the ranger station. He was tired, the weight of the day's strange events still hanging over him. He had tried to piece together what he had learned, but the more he dug, the more questions he had. The bear walking backward, the child that ran with impossible speed, and now the chilling discovery that the park might be a carefully constructed experiment. It was all becoming too much to process. He dropped his gear on the desk and poured himself a cup of coffee, grateful for the brief moment of normalcy. But just as he was about to sit down and review his patrol notes, he heard the door creak open. Marcus looked up, surprised. The door wasn't supposed to open unless it was a scheduled visitor or one of the staff, but standing in the doorway was a woman, a stranger. She was dressed in hiking clothes, her brown hair pulled back in a ponytail, and a jacket that looked too light for the cooler mountain air. She looked out of place, almost like she didn't belong here, yet there she was, smiling in the dim light of the ranger station. "Good evening," she said, her voice sweet but with a tone that felt too practiced. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Marcus stood up slowly, his military instincts kicking in as his mind assessed the situation. It was rare for anyone to arrive at the station this late, especially without any prior notice. And something about the woman's demeanor felt off, too calm, too composed for someone who had just walked into a remote national park ranger station after dark. "No, not at all," Marcus said, his voice neutral. "Can I help you?" The woman took a step forward, her eyes scanning the room with casual interest. She seemed to take in every detail, from the weathered posters on the walls to the stack of paperwork on Marcus's desk. But there was something about the way she looked, like she wasn't just observing, but analyzing. "I'm sorry to arrive so late," she continued, still smiling, but the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "I've been hiking in the park for a few days, and I thought I'd stop by for a bit of water. It's been a long day." Marcus's mind immediately went to the rules. Offer water to after-hours visitors, but do not answer their questions. He had learned this protocol during his orientation. It had felt strange at the time, but now, with this woman standing in front of him, it felt even more out of place. "Of course," Marcus said, trying to keep his tone friendly but distant. "I'll get you some water." He moved to the small kitchen area, filling a paper cup from the cooler. As he handed it to her, he noticed how intently she was watching him, almost as though she were studying his every move. "Thank you," she said, taking the cup from him. But instead of drinking, she simply held it in her hands, as if it were a prop in a scene that she was trying to control. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. It's just that, well, I've been curious about the park, the procedures, the way everything works here. I've been reading some of the pamphlets, but they don't quite answer everything." Marcus's chest tightened, a knot forming in his stomach. Her questions were too pointed, too specific. She wasn't asking about the usual things: trail conditions, wildlife sightings, general park regulations. No, she was asking about procedures, about how the park worked, and most unsettling of all, she was asking about him. His mind raced, but he kept his face neutral. Stay calm, follow the protocol. He reminded himself of the rules, the unspoken ones that had been drilled into him since he first stepped into the park. Offer water, but do not engage. "I'm sorry, but I can't discuss park procedures with visitors," Marcus said, forcing the words out. "It's against the rules. We're not allowed to share certain details." The woman didn't seem put off by his response. In fact, her smile grew just a little wider, but it still didn't reach her eyes. She took a sip of the water and set the cup down on the counter with a deliberate slowness, as if weighing her next words. "I understand," she said. "I'm just curious, that's all. You know, I've been hearing a lot of interesting things about the park, about the rangers, about the work you do here." Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly. "I'm just doing my job," he said curtly. But the woman wasn't done. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze sharp now, almost probing. "You seem like you've been here a while," she said, her voice soft but persistent. "I can tell. You've got that discipline about you. The military background, I'm guessing." Marcus froze for a moment, his pulse quickening. How did she know that? His military background was something he kept private, something he hadn't shared with anyone here at the park. He hadn't even told Summer during his orientation, and yet this woman, this stranger, had pinpointed it immediately. His instincts screamed to question her, to demand how she knew, but the rules, the damn rules. He could feel them pressing down on him, pushing him to remain silent. "That's correct," Marcus said, keeping his voice steady. "I served in the military, but that's not relevant here." The woman's eyes gleamed as if she had just scored a small victory. "No, of course it's not. I didn't mean to pry." She stood up, her movements smooth, almost rehearsed. "But you have to admit it must be a bit strange for someone like you, after all that training, after everything you've seen, to come here and work in such isolation." Marcus didn't answer. The air felt thick, heavy with her presence. She wasn't just a curious visitor. She was someone who knew more than she was letting on. "I should go," she said suddenly, breaking the silence. "I don't want to take up more of your time." She turned to leave, but paused in the doorway, looking over her shoulder at Marcus. "Thank you for the water," she said, her voice soft but chilling. "And remember, some rules are meant to be followed, but others, well, some rules are there to test you." With that, she disappeared into the night, her footsteps fading into the silence of the wilderness. Marcus stood there, staring at the spot where the woman had stood just moments ago. His heart was pounding, his mind racing. Everything about the encounter had been unsettling. It wasn't just the way she had acted, so calm and poised, or the probing questions. It was the way she had known so much about him, about his background, and her cryptic parting words that echoed in his mind. "Some rules are meant to be followed, but others are there to test you." It was a message, a warning. Marcus felt a chill crawl down his spine as he locked the door behind her, securing the building once again. The rules were no longer just strange park regulations. They were something more, something far darker. She had known exactly how to push his buttons, how to get under his skin, and it wasn't just the questions about his military background. It was the way she seemed to know about the strange things happening in the park, things that no one should know. She was no ordinary visitor. She was part of something, part of a game, and Marcus was just beginning to realize how deep that game went. He sat back down at his desk, his hands trembling slightly. The water she had left behind was still on the counter, untouched, but it felt like a symbol of something far more ominous than a simple drink. Marcus knew one thing for sure: he was being watched. And this wasn't just about the rules anymore. He had to uncover the truth, or else he might become a The days that followed the strange encounter with the woman were a blur of conflicting emotions for Marcus. He tried to focus on his routine patrols, but every corner of the park seemed to carry the weight of the unsettling events he had witnessed. The backward walking bear, the impossible speed of the crying child, the strange woman who had come to the station and asked him probing questions. Each new moment felt like a deeper descent into a reality he could no longer trust. The rules, the ones that had seemed so strange at first, were no longer just odd park policies. They were carefully orchestrated instructions designed to provoke specific responses. He couldn't escape the feeling that the park was no longer just a wilderness preserve. It was a stage, and he was the unwilling actor, following a script he couldn't fully understand. As he sat in his quarters late one night, reviewing the latest patrol logs, Marcus's mind returned to the woman, the visitor who had shown up uninvited with questions that had hit too close to home. Everything about her behavior had felt deliberate, like she was studying him. Her strange departure had left an unsettling aftertaste, but it wasn't until the following morning, when he found an unexpected letter slipped under his door, that the truth began to take shape. The envelope was simple, white, and unmarked. There were no logos or return addresses, just Marcus's name written in neat, professional handwriting. As soon as he touched the paper, something deep inside him stirred. A mix of dread and curiosity tightened his chest. He opened it carefully, unfolding the letter. It read, "Marcus Rue, you've been chosen for an exclusive program designed to test your psychological resilience under controlled stressors. The rules you've been given are not part of park procedure, but part of a larger study. The backward walking bear, the child, the strange encounters, they were all designed to provoke specific responses from you as a participant in this experiment. The woman who visited you was part of our team. Your compliance with the rules, your reactions to the anomalies, have all been carefully monitored. Your military background and psychological profile made you an ideal subject for this study. You may believe the park is just a job, a fresh start, but in reality, you've been a part of a carefully constructed experiment from the beginning. There are no accidents here. The park, the wildlife, the visitors, they are all part of the controlled environment designed to push you to your limits. We need you to continue following the protocols. Your response to the situation will be evaluated, and your cooperation is crucial for the success of the program. Failure to comply will result in reassignment to a more intensive phase of the study. Remember, Marcus, you are not just a ranger. You are a test subject. The rules are not negotiable. Follow them, and you will have the chance to contribute to groundbreaking research in psychological adaptation. Fail to comply, and you will become part of the experiment in a way you can't undo. Dr. Juliet Thompson. Marcus's hands trembled as he read the letter. His worst fears, the ones he had only whispered to himself in the dead of night, were now confirmed. He wasn't just a ranger at Yellowstone. He wasn't just there to patrol the park and protect its wildlife. He had been carefully selected for this experiment, this psychological manipulation, all of it, and the rules. They were never about the safety of the park. They were designed to measure his compliance, his fear, his reactions under stress. The realization hit Marcus like a tidal wave, crashing over him and drowning every sense of clarity he had fought to maintain. Everything he had thought was real, the tranquil park, the wildlife, the routine tasks, was nothing more than a facade. The park wasn't just his place of work. It was a lab, a test facility, and he had been nothing more than a subject in someone's twisted psychological experiment. The park's isolation, the strange rules, the unsettling encounters, it all made sense now. The behavior of the animals wasn't random, it was controlled. The backward walking bear, the bizarre actions of the child, the visitors asking unsettling questions, Every encounter had been crafted to provoke specific responses from him. And the rules, they were the guidebook, the framework that dictated how he should react, when he should feel fear, and when he should obey. He felt a deep, visceral betrayal. He had come to Yellowstone seeking peace, a place to heal, to escape the chaos of his past, to find solitude and meaning. But instead, he had been trapped in an experiment, manipulated by forces he hadn't even begun to understand. And the worst part, he had been a willing participant. Every time he followed the rules, every time he obeyed without question, he had unknowingly deepened his involvement in this twisted program. As the truth began to settle in, Marcus's mind kept returning to the woman, the one who had visited him in the ranger station late at night. She had been the first to plant the seed of doubt in his mind. She had asked questions about his military background, about his thoughts on the park, about his experiences. And in doing so, she had revealed that she knew far more than she should. She had played her part perfectly, acting as if she were just a curious traveler. But in reality, she was part of the team monitoring him, gathering data on his responses, his psychological state. He had dismissed her at first, thought of her as just another visitor passing through. But now, in light of the letter, her role became clear. She wasn't just curious, she was there to test him. She had been sent to assess his reactions, to see how he would handle the pressure. And in doing so, she had nudged him closer to the truth. Whether she had done so deliberately or not, Marcus couldn't say. But one thing was certain, she wasn't just an ordinary visitor. She was part of the research team running the experiment. Marcus's mind raced as he pieced everything together. The protocols, the strange behaviors, the odd rules. They weren't just designed to protect the park or its visitors. They were part of a much larger system. A system that had been built to manipulate him, to measure how far he would go to follow orders, how far he would go to suppress his instincts. He thought back to his military service, to the training that had taught him to keep control, to follow orders, to adapt to any environment. He had been trained to survive, to think strategically. And now, it seemed, all of that training was being used against him. The park, the rangers, even the wildlife, they were all part of a larger design, a psychological experiment crafted by people who knew exactly what they were doing. And he was nothing more than a subject, a test case in their twisted research. The realization hit Marcus with the force of a blow. His every instinct screamed to break free, to escape the confines of this experiment and expose the truth. But he knew that escaping would be difficult, if not impossible. The rules had been designed to trap him, to keep him compliant. The park, the people, the animals, they were all part of the control system, and he had already played his part. But no more. For the first time since he had arrived, Marcus felt something stir inside him, something stronger than fear, stronger than the need to comply. It was a sense of determination, of defiance. He had been manipulated long enough. He wouldn't be a puppet in their game any longer. He was going to uncover the truth, expose the people behind this experiment, and free himself from their control. The rules had controlled him up until now, but no more. The morning after receiving the letter was like any other, silent, suffocatingly quiet. But for Marcus, everything had changed. The rules, the protocols, the surveillance, it was all part of an intricate system designed to break him down, to manipulate him into becoming a compliant subject in their twisted experiment. As he sat in his quarters, staring at the page that confirmed everything he had feared, a single thought consumed him: no more. He had spent his entire career, his entire life following orders, adhering to rules that made sense, rules that were designed for safety, for duty, for a higher purpose. But this was different. These rules weren't about protection. They weren't even about the park. They were about control. They were about turning him into a lab rat, someone who could be manipulated and studied. And for the first time, he could feel the cage around him, the invisible bars closing in, and he refused to be trapped. The morning patrol was uneventful until it wasn't. As Marcus drove through the park, the familiar sights seemed more suffocating than peaceful. The bison, the elk, the tall pines swaying in the wind, they were no longer symbols of the wild. They had become part of the stage, part of the experiment. Even the sun rising over the valley felt like something he had no control over. He was simply following the path laid out for him. But then, as he turned a corner near the Lamar River, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A group of 3 people sitting on a bench, exactly as the rules described. 2 adults, a teenager, perfectly still, watching his vehicle approach with synchronized precision. Their eyes locked on him, their smiles wide, too perfect, too calculated. The 6th rule flashed in his mind. If you encounter 3 or more people sitting together outdoors, drive away immediately. For a moment, Marcus considered following the rule. But as he watched them, something snapped inside him. This wasn't real. None of this was. The people, the animals, the rules, it was all a performance. The experiment was no longer something distant, it was here in front of him. And he couldn't just drive away anymore. He slammed on the brakes. Marcus parked the truck a few feet from the bench. The 3 figures didn't move, didn't even flinch as he stepped out of the vehicle. They simply stared at him, their smiles still locked in place, their faces eerily blank. He approached them slowly, his eyes scanning their every movement. The wind rustled the leaves around him, but there was no sound from the 3 figures. No natural reactions, no movement of life. They were statues, part of the experiment, nothing more. "Why are you here?" Marcus asked, his voice steady but laced with an edge of anger. He wasn't going to follow the protocol. He wasn't going to comply anymore. The teenager's face shifted into that same practiced smile. "Just waiting," the teenager said, their voice too smooth, too rehearsed. Marcus's fists clenched. Waiting for what? The 2 adults didn't speak. They only turned their heads to look at Marcus, their eyes cold and unblinking as if they were reading a script waiting for the next line. He had enough. Marcus turned on his heel and walked back to his truck, his mind reeling with fury. The world around him felt claustrophobic, oppressive. Every step he took felt like a deliberate act of resistance, a rebellion against a system that had designed this nightmare. Marcus knew the time for subtlety was over. He couldn't ignore the truth anymore. The park was no longer just a job. It was a controlled environment, a psychological experiment that he had unknowingly walked into. The rules, the strange events, it was all carefully orchestrated by the research team. He had to learn everything he could about them. About Dr. Juliet Thompson, the woman who had planted the seed of doubt in his mind. About the team running the experiment. About who was controlling all of this. But whenever Marcus tried to get closer to the truth, something, or someone, stopped him. The first attempt came when he tried to access the park's personnel records, hoping to find any indication of the research team's involvement. He made his way to the admin office, but the file he needed was mysteriously locked. A security officer stood just outside, watching him with an intensity that felt like a silent warning. "No access," the officer said simply when Marcus asked for the file. "Those records are restricted." Restricted. A word that felt like a heavy iron door slamming shut. The next step was to find out about Dr. Thompson herself. Marcus had to get her file, had to know who she really was and what role she played in the experiments. But whenever he tried to make progress, something seemed to block his path. He caught wind of her name from an old ranger's offhand comment, mentioning her involvement in park studies. When Marcus tried to follow up, however, the response was always the same. "She's not in the field right now," or "you'll have to go through official channels to get any information about Dr. Thompson." It was clear that the authorities weren't just controlling the park, they were controlling the information too. The more Marcus pushed, the more resistance he faced. The park staff grew increasingly distant, and the once casual interactions he had with his fellow rangers began to feel cold, calculated. Conversations were clipped, and when he asked about certain procedures, his questions were dismissed without explanation. The walls were closing in. Even the simple act of questioning felt dangerous. When Marcus asked about the wildlife research team, one of the older rangers, Steve, warned him cryptically, "Some things are better left untouched." Steve had been around long enough to know what happened to rangers who asked too many questions. Marcus could see the fear in his eyes, a fear that was hard to ignore. Every time he tried to investigate, he was blocked, either through the system, through the people around him, or through the suffocating rules that now felt more like chains than guidelines. His every step was being watched, monitored. It was as though the entire park had been turned into a prison, and Marcus was now a prisoner caught in an elaborate experiment designed to break him. But Marcus wasn't giving up. The truth was out there, and he was determined to find it. The more resistance he faced, the more his defiance grew. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about fighting back against the system that had been controlling him, the experiment that had turned his life into a test subject's nightmare. He had started breaking the rules, small things at first, like ignoring the protocols during his patrols, questioning the park's procedures, and even engaging with the visitors who came through. But each act of defiance felt like a small victory, a rebellion against the system that had tried to mold him into something he was not. Marcus knew the risks. He knew that pushing back against the authorities would make him a target. But as he stood on the edge of the park, surrounded by the wilderness he had once sought for peace, he realized something. He was done playing by their rules. The rules weren't there for his safety. They were there to break him, to control him, and Marcus refused to be controlled. It started as a normal patrol, or at least it seemed that way. The sun had barely crested the mountain ridges when Marcus set out for his usual route along the northern edge of the park. The air was crisp, the ground still damp with morning dew, and the silence of the wilderness felt both peaceful and suffocating. The rules had been drilled into him, protocols that guided every step, every action. Do not intervene, follow the schedule, avoid anything outside the established norm. But that day, Marcus could feel it in the air. Something was wrong. There was an odd tension that he couldn't shake, a nagging sense of being watched, of being a part of something far bigger than just this park. The patterns of strange occurrences, encounters with backward-walking bears, mysterious visitors, and impossible situations, had all felt like parts of a carefully constructed test. But this day, it was different. As he drove along a remote stretch of the Grand Loop, Marcus's eyes caught something strange ahead. It was a flash of light, too bright and sharp against the morning sky. He slowed the truck, narrowing his eyes against the sunlight. At first, it appeared to be a group of hikers or tourists, but as he got closer, he realized it wasn't quite right. The figures were standing perfectly still, frozen in place, scattered in various positions along the trail. He had seen tourists like this before, sitting on benches or gathered at viewpoints, but these individuals weren't moving. And then Marcus noticed the light. It wasn't coming from the sun or any natural source. It was a soft, almost ethereal glow emanating from the figures themselves. It flickered like the light of a distant fire, a light that seemed to distort the air around it, rippling like heat waves. His heart skipped a beat. This wasn't normal. Marcus immediately reached for the radio, but the static was overwhelming. The usual crackle of routine communications was gone. In its place, there was only a buzzing interference that made it impossible to get a clear signal. His fingers trembled as he switched channels, trying to reach dispatch. But again, nothing. No answer. Just static. He parked the truck a safe distance away from the figures, the eerie light still pulsing in the morning air, creating an unnatural glow in the otherwise serene wilderness. The rules flooded his mind. Stay in your vehicle, do not engage, report to dispatch. But none of those instructions made sense in this moment. Something was wrong, something far beyond the scope of the rules. The situation felt unnatural. He stepped out of the vehicle, instinctively drawing the small handgun he kept holstered at his side. He wasn't sure what he expected, but his mind was racing, trying to make sense of the surreal scene in front of him. As he crept closer to the figures, he realized they weren't tourists. They weren't even human. Their forms flickered in and out of focus, like images on a damaged television screen, as if their presence was somehow distorted. Each figure stood motionless, but they seemed to be connected, unmoving but still somehow synchronized. The air around them felt charged, like the world itself was bending to some unseen force. There was no sound, no birds, no rustling of leaves, just a chilling, suffocating quiet. The rules were no longer applicable. No protocol covered this. Marcus had to act. His instincts screamed for him to move forward, to understand what this was, to take action. This was beyond the park's usual wildlife behavior, beyond the strange rules that governed his life in the park. This was something far more sinister, and Marcus knew deep down that he was about to confront the truth he had been avoiding. His training, his military training, told him to take a step back, to remain calm, to call for backup and wait for instructions. But there were no instructions for this. His mind was racing as he weighed his options. Was this another controlled test? Had they orchestrated this event for him to witness? Or was this the result of something even darker, something beyond the park, beyond the team that had been manipulating him? He moved closer, each step slow and deliberate, his eyes fixed on the figures. As he got within a few yards, he noticed something even stranger. The figures were not only flickering, but their eyes, if you could call them eyes, appeared to follow him. Not in the way someone might look at you from a distance, but in a way that suggested awareness, as if they were aware of his every movement, his every thought. This wasn't part of the experiment, Marcus thought. This wasn't in the rules. His mind snapped back to the radio. He needed to communicate, to understand what was happening, but there was still nothing but static. The control, the power that had been imposed on him, had been severed, and with it, any semblance of the normal world he had tried to live in. And then one of the figures moved, the figure closest to him, an adult male, its outline flickering in and out of focus, took a slow, deliberate step forward. Its face was nothing more than a blur, but Marcus could feel its eyes on him, intense, expecting something. The air grew even colder, and the ground beneath his feet seemed to shift. He stumbled slightly, trying to regain his balance. The figure reached its hand out towards him. The fingers were unnaturally long, almost too elongated, as if they were stretching, deforming as they reached for him. Marcus froze. He couldn't tell if he was seeing things clearly anymore. The image in front of him felt like a dream, a nightmare, something that existed on the edge of reality. But as the figure's hand drew closer, Marcus knew there was no more time to question. Without thinking, he reached for the radio once again, but as his fingers brushed it, a crackling surge of energy shot through the air, almost like an electric shock. The radio shorted out, completely dead. The figure's hand was inches from his face, and Marcus was paralyzed not by fear but by the overwhelming sense that he had no control over this moment. This wasn't just another test. This wasn't about survival or protocol. This was real. The figure paused, and for the first time Marcus saw it clearly. The face was contorted, as if the features were not meant to exist in this dimension. The skin was too smooth, too perfect, with a sickly, almost translucent glow. The eyes, those eyes, were black voids like the deep abyss of the unknown. But what struck him most was the realization he was part of something much bigger, something beyond his comprehension. This wasn't just a psychological experiment. This wasn't just a test to observe his reactions. It was a manipulation, something designed to push him to the very edge, to make him confront the supernatural. The rules, the park, everything, it was all part of a much darker plan. The figure's hand touched his forehead lightly, like a whisper of contact. In that moment, Marcus's world went black. The air was thick with tension as Marcus stumbled away from the mysterious figures, still shaken by what had just transpired. His heart pounded in his chest, his mind a swirl of panic, disbelief, and anger. The encounter with the figures, those strange, flickering entities, had shattered the last thread of normalcy in his world. He couldn't deny it anymore. This wasn't just an experiment. It was a manipulation, a psychological game designed to break him. As the reality of the situation sunk in, something inside Marcus snapped. He wasn't going to stand here, waiting to be tested, prodded, and controlled any longer. His life was no longer his own. The rules, the protocols, the strange occurrences, it was all a web, and he was trapped in the middle. He had to leave. There was no more pretending, no more following the protocols that had bound him for so long. He knew what was at stake now. The experiment wasn't just a test, it was a trap, and he had no intention of staying in it any longer. If he wanted to survive, if he wanted to escape, he had to act now. The decision came to him as suddenly as the fear had. He was leaving. He didn't care if it meant breaking every rule, defying every order he'd ever followed. Marcus had reached the breaking point, and now there was only one thing left to do: run. Marcus wasted no time. He turned away from the eerie figures and sprinted back to his truck, his legs heavy but determined. Every step felt like a liberation from the suffocating control that had gripped him for so long. As he reached the truck, he threw open the door and started the engine with a sense of urgency. The engine roared to life, but as he slammed the gear into drive, a shiver ran down his spine. The park, the whole place, felt like it was watching him, waiting for him to make his next move. With a deep breath, he pressed the accelerator, speeding down the winding road toward the park's entrance. The towering trees blurred by the windows as he raced through the park, his eyes constantly darting between the road and the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something following him. He didn't know exactly where he was going, but he knew one thing for sure. He had to leave the park. The rules, the experiment, they didn't matter anymore. The park had never been a sanctuary for him. It had been a prison all along, and now he was trying to break out. But just as the gate to the park came into view, a sudden realization struck him like a lightning bolt. He wasn't the only one trying to escape. As he neared the exit, his eyes scanned the road ahead. And then he saw them, other figures, walking slowly along the path just outside the park's boundaries. At first, he thought they were just regular hikers, but as he drew closer, the truth became impossible to ignore. The people walking ahead of him were just like the figures he had seen before, too still, too mechanical in their movements. There was no casual chatter, no interaction with the natural surroundings. They were walking, yes, but it was as if they were on a predetermined path, a script they were following without deviation. Marcus slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as he came to a stop just in front of the group. He blinked in disbelief. They were the same people, the same faces he had seen in earlier encounters, the same robotic movements, the same unnatural calm. He knew then that he wasn't alone. He wasn't the only one caught in this twisted experiment. These people, they were trapped just like him, manipulated and controlled by the same unseen forces. Marcus's stomach dropped as the realization set in. He wasn't an isolated case. This wasn't just happening to him. These were other test subjects, people who had been subjected to the same psychological manipulation, people who were also struggling to break free. One of the figures, a man in his 50s with graying hair and a worn, desperate look in his eyes, approached Marcus's truck. He leaned forward slightly, his voice low, tinged with fear. You're trying to leave too, aren't you?" The man asked, his voice shaking. "You're trying to escape. They are watching. They know what we're doing." Marcus's eyes widened. He knew then that this man had been through the same thing. He was a part of the experiment too, just like Marcus. They were all part of it. "They're watching?" Marcus asked, his voice cracking with disbelief. The man nodded, his eyes darting nervously around. "Every step, every move we make, they can see everything. We're all just pieces in their game. I've been trying to get out for months, but they won't let us." Marcus's heart raced. This wasn't just about the park anymore. This was bigger. The experiment wasn't just happening to him. It was happening to everyone who had been sent here, to every ranger, every worker, every person who had been brought into the fold. And if they didn't escape now, they would be stuck here forever, part of an ongoing experiment with no way out. "We have to go," Marcus said, his mind made up. "We can't stay here. We're not going to be their test subjects anymore." The man hesitated for a moment, looking back at the others who had started to gather around the truck. His face was pale, but there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes. Maybe you're right," he said quietly. "But you have to know, they won't let us leave. They'll stop us. We'll be trapped." Marcus knew the risks, but he also knew that if he stayed here, if he followed the rules, if he continued to comply, he would be nothing more than a pawn in their twisted game. He had to escape. He pushed the accelerator down once more, the engine roaring to life as the truck surged forward, the figures slowly disappearing in his rearview mirror. But his freedom was short-lived. Suddenly, blue lights flashed in the distance, followed by the unmistakable sound of a siren. A Park Service vehicle had appeared behind him, its headlights cutting through the early morning mist. Marcus's heart skipped a beat as he saw it gaining speed. They were coming for him. Without thinking, Marcus veered off the road, cutting through the dense trees. He was no longer following any path but his own. The rules were irrelevant now. He was running from the experiment, running from the people who had orchestrated his life. The pursuit continued for miles, with Park Service vehicles trailing behind him, cutting through the wilderness in search of him. But Marcus didn't care anymore. He was done being a part of their game. The sound of tires crunching over dirt, the rustling of trees, the occasional crackle of the radio, it all blurred into the background as he pushed forward, desperate for freedom. Eventually, Marcus reached a point where the park's fences loomed ahead, marking the boundary. The exit, the only way out. He could see the flashing lights of the vehicles getting closer, the voices crackling over the radio as they coordinated the chase. But Marcus wasn't stopping. He didn't care if they caught him. He wasn't going to be a test subject anymore. This was his final stand. With one last burst of speed, he took the truck straight through a weak point in the fence, a gap in the chain link that had been hidden by overgrown brush. The truck shot forward, breaking through the barrier. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest as the trees on the other side of the fence began to blur. He was out. For the first time in months, he felt the rush of freedom. But even as the park slipped further behind him, he knew the chase wasn't over. They would come after him. They would keep trying to reel him back in. But for now, Marcus had won. And he was going to make sure the world knew what happened here. Marcus had been running for what felt like hours, his chest heaving, his mind spinning with the adrenaline of his escape. He had broken through the park's barriers, crossed into unfamiliar terrain, and even driven past the watchful eyes of the Park Service. But no matter how far he went, the nagging feeling that he wasn't truly free lingered like a shadow over him. In the distance, he could see a town, nothing more than a cluster of buildings at the edge of the wilderness, far from the reach of the park. Marcus pressed on, determined to get as far as possible. But as he entered the outskirts of the small town, something stopped him in his tracks. A black SUV with tinted windows was parked at the end of the narrow street. Its presence seemed too deliberate, too out of place. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He instinctively reached for his radio, but the device had long since gone dead. No backup, no help. He was on his own. And then a voice. Marcus Rue, it said, a deep, authoritative tone that sent a chill crawling down his spine. I've been waiting for you. Marcus turned, his muscles tensed, ready for a fight or flight response. But there was no one standing in front of him. The voice came again, this time from behind him. Two men dressed in crisp suits, far too formal for the rugged wilderness they were standing in, emerged from the SUV. Their expressions were calm, calculated. One of them was middle-aged, with a commanding presence. The other was younger, his sharp features betraying a coldness that sent a warning signal through Marcus's gut. They didn't look like park rangers, military personnel, or anyone who should have been in this remote area. They looked like people who had been waiting for him. The older man stepped forward, extending a hand toward Marcus, but the movement was slow, deliberate, as if he was trying to read him. Marcus, the man said with a slight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I'm glad you made it this far. We've been watching you. You're exactly what we need. Marcus instinctively recoiled, but the younger man stepped forward before he could back away further. We need to talk, the younger man said, his voice icy, about everything you've been through. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. His hand instinctively gripped the edge of his holster, but he made no move to draw his weapon. He was out of options, out of time. Who are you? Marcus demanded, his voice low with suspicion. The older man smiled again. We're the people running the experiment, Marcus. We've been waiting for this moment, and you've been chosen for something bigger than just a simple park ranger job. Welcome to the program." The words hit Marcus like a punch to the stomach. Program, the experiment. He thought he was already out. He had left the park, escaped their control. But this was something entirely different. The older man, his name was General Daniel Shaw. Marcus would later learn, motioned for him to follow. "Come, let's sit down. You need to understand what's really going on here." Marcus hesitated for only a moment before his instincts drove him forward. He didn't trust them. He didn't trust anything about this situation, but curiosity was a powerful force. The trio made their way to a small clearing just beyond the town. The landscape around them was starkly different from the park, a sprawling field surrounded by low hills. The black SUV remained behind them, parked under the watchful eyes of more men in suits who had emerged from seemingly nowhere. Marcus realized now that he had walked right into something he couldn't have prepared for. General Shaw gestured for Marcus to sit on a nearby bench, which had been set up like a temporary meeting point in the middle of nowhere. The younger man, Agent Carter, leaned against the vehicle, arms folded, eyeing Marcus with a calculating gaze. "We've been tracking you for months, Marcus," Shaw began, sitting across from him, his hands clasped together in front of him like a professor about to deliver a lecture. "You were perfect for this project. Your military background, your PTSD, your psychological profile. Everything about you was exactly what we needed for the research we're conducting." Marcus felt his stomach twist. This couldn't be happening. His trauma, his experiences in the military, the things he had worked so hard to bury, were now the core of this twisted experiment. They had been using him. "You're part of a military psychological warfare program," Shaw continued, leaning forward, his voice almost conspiratorial now. "A controlled study designed to study the effects of psychological manipulation and trauma on soldiers. The park wasn't just a job. It wasn't just a quiet, peaceful place for you to escape. It was a testing ground." Marcus's mind reeled. "Testing ground." He whispered, trying to process the words. "You used me. You've been using me this whole time." Shaw nodded, his expression calm. "We needed to test the effectiveness of certain psychological strategies, how a soldier, particularly one with PTSD, responds when placed in extreme conditions. We manipulated the environment around you. The bear walking backwards, the crying child, the visitors, the strange rules. Every single aspect of your experience here was designed to provoke specific reactions. Your obedience, your fear, your decision-making under stress, it's all part of the study." Agent Carter stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Marcus. "You weren't just a test subject here. You were part of a much bigger program," he added. "This goes far beyond national parks. The techniques we've been testing have military applications, interrogation, psychological manipulation, and control tactics. We're developing methods to break a person's will without physical force, to control them psychologically." Marcus's breath caught in his throat as the truth began to sink in. His military experience, the thing he had thought would give him peace, had been weaponized against him. His trauma, his brokenness, had been studied and exploited for a purpose he hadn't even begun to fathom. "You've been a part of this experiment from the very beginning," Shaw said softly, watching Marcus's face carefully. "You didn't know it, but you were always being watched, always being tested. The rules, the behaviors, they were meant to push you to test your limits. And now that you're here, you've become part of a larger picture. Marcus could feel his pulse in his throat, his breath shallow as he realized the full scope of what had happened to him. This was no isolated incident. This was part of a systematic military program, a psychological operation. Shaw looked at him steadily. But you're not the only one. There are others like you spread across different locations. We've been testing soldiers in different environments, breaking them down, seeing how far we can push them before they break. Your journey here, your trauma, your actions, your resistance, has been valuable data for us. Marcus's mind raced, the weight of Shaw's words bearing down on him. Everything he had thought he knew, everything he had believed about the park and his new life, was a lie. He had been trapped in an experiment, one that had used his PTSD, his brokenness, his desire for peace, as tools to manipulate and control him. You wanted to see how far you could push me, Marcus said, his voice cracking with rage. To make me comply, to break me, to turn me into a weapon. My trauma, it was never just mine, it was yours to control. Shaw's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something behind his eyes. Satisfaction. Exactly. And now we know what works. We know what we need to improve. This experiment wasn't just about you, it was about a methodology. We've already begun using the data from this and other locations to refine our techniques. Soon, this kind of psychological warfare will be implemented in real-world operations. Your trauma isn't just an accident, Marcus. It's the key to something much bigger. Marcus sat still for a moment, absorbing the full scope of Shaw's words. It wasn't just about him. He was just one small piece in a much larger and far more dangerous plan. His life, his pain, his past, everything he had fought to escape had been weaponized. The weight of the truth hit Marcus like a physical blow. He was part of something far bigger than he had ever realized, something that went beyond his understanding. His trauma had been manipulated for an agenda he hadn't signed up for. The stakes were higher than just his survival. This was about psychological control, manipulation at a level he couldn't have imagined. And then, in that moment of clarity, something inside him hardened. The reality of what he had been subjected to, the betrayal, it filled him with a fire he hadn't felt in years. He was done being a part of their game. He was done being the experiment. But now, the fight wasn't just for his survival. It was for something much bigger. The night was still, too still. The usual sounds of the wilderness, the chirping of crickets, the rustle of leaves were absent, leaving only the oppressive silence that surrounded Marcus as he huddled in the back of the run-down cabin where he had taken refuge. His hands were steady, despite the racing thoughts in his mind. This was the moment, the last chance to escape, to break free from the chains of the experiment that had been imposed on him. He had spent weeks planning, gathering allies, and piecing together everything he had learned. He was no longer alone in his defiance. The other Rangers, those who had become disillusioned with the experiment, had agreed to stand with him. Together, they would make one final stand against the forces that had controlled them for so long. But this time, Marcus wasn't just fighting for his freedom. He was fighting for his soul. As he checked the gear one last time, flashlights, radios, maps, and weapons, the weight of the situation settled over him. They had no backup, no safety net. This escape would either succeed or they would be buried in the same system that had entrapped them. There was no turning back now. Marcus, along with the others, had come up with a plan. They would leave the park under the cover of darkness, making their way through the dense forest to an area where the park's surveillance would be weak. From there, they would break through the barriers, cutting through the fencing where it was weakest. It wasn't going to be easy. There were too many eyes on them now. But after everything that had happened, Marcus knew they had to try. The final step of their plan was simple: escape the park and expose everything. They had learned too much to remain silent. They needed to be free to reveal the truth to the world. But they had to do it now. Once the experiment's masterminds realized they were trying to escape, they would stop at nothing to bring them back. As Marcus and the other rangers made their way through the woods, every step felt like it was bringing them closer to freedom. But something felt wrong. The air was thick with tension, and Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It wasn't just paranoia. He had learned to trust his instincts in the military, and they were screaming at him to be careful. Suddenly, a rustling noise broke the silence. Before Marcus could react, Agent Carter appeared from the shadows, stepping into their path. His sharp eyes locked with Marcus's, and for a moment Marcus thought the world had stopped. Carter's expression was unreadable. He didn't speak at first, but then his lips curled into a tight smile. "You're not getting away," he said coldly. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. It was a trap. Carter had been one of them all along, a mole planted within the ranks of the Rangers to keep tabs on them. The others hadn't realized it yet, but Marcus had always known there was something off about him. His role was more than just to monitor. Carter was there to stop any Ranger from escaping. "You're part of this too," Marcus said, his voice low and filled with the weight of the betrayal. "You knew what was happening to us." Carter shrugged, his smile never wavering. "I know exactly what's going on, and I know that you won't make it out of here alive." Before Marcus could respond, several other park security personnel emerged from the shadows, their presence making it clear that the escape attempt had already been foiled. It was all part of the plan, to bring them to the point where they would have no choice but to face the system head-on. The standoff was tense, every second dragging on like an eternity. The Rangers, who had once fought side by side to protect the park, now found themselves on opposite sides of a fight for their very lives. The security personnel were positioned around the cabin, weapons drawn, ready to subdue Marcus and his allies. "Marcus, you don't have to do this." General Shaw's voice came from the darkness, the sound of his boots crunching on the gravel. "You can still be a part of this. You can still be a part of something greater than yourself. All we ask is your compliance." Marcus's chest tightened as Shaw's figure materialized from the shadows, flanked by other high-ranking officials in suits. His words were cold, calculated, but they had lost their power. Marcus had seen the system for what it truly was, and he wasn't afraid anymore. "I'm not your test subject," Marcus spat, his voice filled with contempt. "I'm a person, and I'm done playing your game." Shaw's face hardened. "You can't escape, Marcus. You'll never be free from this system. You were designed for this." Marcus took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision press down on him. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about making a choice. He had been broken, manipulated, used as a tool for someone else's experiment. But this was the moment he had to decide what kind of person he would become. He turned to the Rangers, his voice now calm but filled with determination. "We leave, now." The Rangers, still stunned by Carter's betrayal, hesitated. But then Marcus's words ignited something within them. The fight, the drive to resist, to not let their lives be controlled any longer. With one swift motion, Marcus lunged forward, knocking Carter's gun from his hand and disarming the first security guard who tried to move in on him. The others followed his lead, and in a blur of movement they fought their way toward freedom. Shaw's voice echoed across the clearing. "Stop them! Do whatever it takes!" The chaos erupted. Marcus ducked as gunfire rang out, the sound of bullets hitting the trees around him. But he didn't stop. Nothing would stop him now. They fought tooth and nail through the dark woods, with the park's security hot on their heels. Each move was calculated, a desperate push toward the boundary. The weight of everything they had endured, their trauma, the manipulation, the years spent as pawns, was now coming to a head. This was the final stand. They reached the park's perimeter, a weak point in the fencing just like they had planned. Marcus and the Rangers fought past the last few security guards blocking their way, a brutal push to the finish. And finally, with a single, swift motion, Marcus cut through the fence with a pair of bolt cutters. They were free. The Rangers crossed through the gap in the fence, emerging into the wilderness beyond. The cold air of freedom filled their lungs, and for a moment they stopped, just to catch their breath, just to feel that they had made it. They weren't out of danger yet. They had to keep moving. But for the first time in months, Marcus felt the weight of their confinement lift. He wasn't just running from the park. He was running toward something, toward the truth, toward freedom, and toward his own redemption. But even as they made their way into the night, Marcus knew the fight wasn't over. They would be hunted. They would be pursued. The people who had controlled them weren't just going to let them go. But now Marcus had something they didn't: hope. The night after their daring escape was both an end and a beginning. The sound of their breath, ragged and heavy, filled the air as Marcus and the Rangers made their way through the wilderness, leaving the park and its oppressive control behind them. For the first time in months, Marcus felt the weight of his own mind return. The suffocating fog of manipulation, the constant surveillance, the rules that had bound him like chains, they were starting to fade, but the questions they left behind lingered. As they huddled together by a makeshift campfire, Marcus stared into the flames, his thoughts racing. He had spent so much time focused on survival, on escaping the immediate danger, that he had never fully grasped the true scope of the system that had held him captive. Now, as the night surrounded him and the distant stars seemed like tiny dots of freedom, the reality began to set in. This wasn't just about one park. This wasn't just about his story. The system that had manipulated and controlled him, the same system that had used his trauma as a tool to break him down, was far larger, far more insidious than he could have imagined. He had glimpsed the beginning of the operation, but now the truth felt even darker. The escape had been a victory, but Marcus knew it wasn't the end. The experiment's reach was far beyond the park's boundaries, and he understood that now. He had been a test subject, sure, but the park wasn't the only place where these tactics had been applied. The more he thought about it, the more he realized the terrifying implications. If they could do this to someone like him, someone with military training, someone with the experience to question authority, then they could do it to anyone. Anyone who had a past, anyone vulnerable, anyone who had been broken in some way. They had used his PTSD to manipulate him, to study his reactions, to push him to the brink. But this wasn't an isolated event. This was part of a much broader system, one that had been silently creeping into more places than he could have imagined. He had learned too much, seen too much. He couldn't just go back to his old life, could he? He couldn't just walk away from the truth. The experiment wasn't confined to the park. Marcus had been part of something far bigger, something that stretched across the military, across government agencies, even across the world. They had experimented on veterans, soldiers, people like him who had served their country and had come back with scars they had weaponized. But now Marcus was different. He wasn't just a test subject anymore. He was awake. His resolve grew stronger. He could see now that the system wasn't just a set of isolated events. It was an infrastructure, carefully designed and cultivated, all to manipulate those who were vulnerable. But if he had learned anything from his time as a soldier, it was that nothing was beyond the reach of a determined mind. Marcus couldn't just let this go. He couldn't let the manipulation continue, not for him and certainly not for anyone else. The first thing he had to do was expose it, to get the truth out. But how? He had no resources, no connections. They had already taken away everything from him. His records were erased. His military past had been compromised, and he was now a wanted man, a fugitive. They had erased his identity, but they had underestimated him. As the fire crackled, he looked around at the other rangers huddled together, their faces tired but resolute. They were all in this together now. They knew the truth. They had seen what he had seen. And while their escape was far from simple, the spark of rebellion had already ignited within them. "I don't know about you," Marcus began, breaking the silence, "but I'm not running anymore. We're going to expose them. We need to let the world know what's really going on." The others exchanged uneasy glances. It wasn't that they didn't agree with Marcus. They had all been subject to the same twisted experiment. But Marcus could feel the fear in the air. It was one thing to escape. It was another thing to expose the system to the world. They had seen the power the system wielded. They had seen how it could erase someone without a trace, how it could make people disappear. But Marcus was done running. He had to fight back. "I know we can't trust anyone in the government," Marcus continued. "I know they've built a wall around this and they have eyes everywhere. But if we're going to do this, we have to expose the truth. We need proof." They all nodded. There were a few quiet murmurs of agreement. And then Steve, one of the rangers who had been with Marcus from the start, spoke up. "We'll need evidence," Steve said quietly. "We'll need something solid, but they've covered their tracks so well. They've erased everything, and no one will believe us without proof. We need to hit them where it hurts." Marcus thought about it for a moment. "The data," he said, his voice cutting through the air. "The documents, the research, the evidence is out there. We just have to get to it." It was the only thing that made sense. The system wasn't invisible. It had left footprints, trails of information that could be tracked down. But those trails were buried, hidden under layers of bureaucracy, military clearances, and government contracts. Getting to the data wouldn't be easy. They would have to infiltrate the system, bypassing the security and manipulation that had been used against them. But Marcus knew it was possible. "We need to infiltrate their communications, their systems. We need access to their records, their research." Marcus continued, his tone growing more urgent. "Once we have that, once we have proof, we can go public. We'll bring it all down. They can't erase it all." However, the more Marcus thought about the plan, the more he realized how deep the system's roots went. It wasn't just a conspiracy inside the park or a small operation run by a few rogue officials. It was much bigger, global even. The experiment's reach had spread far beyond Yellowstone. They were controlling soldiers, veterans, and anyone vulnerable enough to be manipulated into their system. This wasn't just a few isolated incidents. It was a massive program, a psychological warfare machine operating on a scale that was almost impossible to grasp. Marcus knew he couldn't take on this fight alone. This was bigger than him. It was bigger than any one person or group. But the more he looked at the Rangers around him, Steve, Johnny, and the others, the more he realized they could fight back together. "I know this isn't going to be easy," Marcus said, breaking the silence once again. "But we have one thing they don't: knowledge. We know what they are doing, and now we have the chance to stop it." Marcus sat back, taking a deep breath, his mind racing. He understood now that the fight ahead would be the most difficult battle of his life. But this wasn't just a battle for survival. It wasn't about escaping the park anymore. It was about exposing a system that had taken everything from him and turned his past into a weapon. The plan would take time. It would require secrecy, patience, and precision. The system that controlled them was vast and all-encompassing. But Marcus had a new understanding of it. It was a system built on fear, on control, and on manipulation. It had been designed to break people down and use them for its own purpose. But Marcus had something more now. He had a reason to fight. As the fire flickered and the Rangers gathered around, Marcus's resolve only grew stronger. The darkness surrounding them was not just external. It was within the very system that had tried to destroy them. But they were going to bring it down, together. The day had come. The plan was set into motion, and Marcus stood at the threshold of his old life and the uncertain future ahead. His fingers trembled, but not from fear. No, now he felt something different. It was resolve, determination. He had spent weeks gathering intel, contacting allies, and setting up connections with people on the outside. Those who were not part of the experiment, people who could help him expose the conspiracy once and for all. And it was time. Standing in the wilderness, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Marcus understood the enormity of the battle that lay ahead. He was fighting for his freedom, but more than that, he was fighting for the freedom of everyone who had been manipulated and controlled by this system. And he wouldn't let it continue any longer. The Rangers had already packed their things. They knew the risks of what they were about to do, but there was no turning back now. The park officials had underestimated them. They thought they could control them, break them down, and make them compliant, but they had forgotten one key thing: resilience. Marcus had made sure to cover every angle. He had contacted journalists, military allies, and government insiders who were not part of the system. They had agreed to help him expose the operation, but only if they could get hard, irrefutable evidence. The conspiracy had to be laid bare for the world to see, and Marcus was determined to do whatever it took to make that happen. It was time for phase 1 of the plan: infiltrate. Marcus had learned a long time ago that the first step to breaking any system was to infiltrate it from within. And that's exactly what he did. He had already mapped out the park's communications network, its surveillance infrastructure, and the key points where the data was stored. They had become too comfortable, too confident in their ability to control him. But Marcus was no longer the broken man they had once manipulated. He had learned how to play their game, and now he was going to rewrite the rules. He and the Rangers snuck back into the park under the cover of night, careful not to alert the authorities. They moved quickly, moving from one secure location to the next, ensuring that the authorities didn't see them coming. As they approached the control center, Marcus's heart raced. This was it. This was the moment they would either succeed or fail. But they weren't alone. Agent Carter had been watching, just as he had been watching everything else. But this time he wasn't ready for Marcus. When they reached the main server room, Carter appeared from the shadows, his eyes cold and calculating. "You thought you could escape?" Carter's voice was laced with amusement, but Marcus could see the fear in his eyes. This wasn't about power for him. This was about control, and Marcus knew he couldn't let Carter win. "Get out of our way," Marcus said, his voice low but steady. "We're done with your game." Carter's lips curled into a smile. "You think this is over? You think you're the first to try to expose this? You're nothing but a pawn in their game." Marcus didn't flinch. He had heard enough. Carter's words, his threats, they didn't matter anymore. They were just part of the system, a system that Marcus had already decided to tear apart. Without a second thought, Marcus lunged at Carter, knocking the gun out of his hand and throwing him into the nearby wall. A brief but intense struggle ensued, but Marcus was quicker, stronger now. He had become a man driven by something much more powerful than fear, purpose. As Carter staggered to his feet, his face filled with disbelief, Marcus held his ground. "This ends now. You're not stopping us." With Carter temporarily neutralized, Marcus and the Rangers moved forward. They accessed the main server, the nerve center of the entire operation. Marcus's hands shook as he typed in the command to bypass the security protocols. He had learned a lot during his time in the park. They needed the data to expose the entire conspiracy, and they needed it now. But there was no time to celebrate. As the data began to download, the alarms went off, and Marcus could hear the distant sound of approaching park security vehicles. The countdown had begun. The room was filled with urgency. The Rangers worked in unison, grabbing files and encrypting the data as quickly as they could. Every second counted. But just as Marcus thought they were safe, the door burst open. General Shaw stepped into the room, his cold gaze locking onto Marcus. He wasn't surprised. He had expected this. "You think you've won?" Shaw's voice was ice cold, but there was a hint of frustration beneath it. "You've failed. You can't expose what doesn't exist. Everything you've seen, everything you think you know, it's all part of the plan." Marcus stood tall. "The plan ends tonight. You're done." Shaw's eyes narrowed. "You think you can defeat us? This isn't just about the park. It's bigger than that. We've been preparing this for years. You can't break the system. You never will." But Marcus was ready. "The system's already broken, Shaw. It's just that no one's dared to tear it apart until now." Marcus and his team fought their way to the exit with security closing in. The data was secure, the truth was in their hands, and there was no going back now. They reached the outer boundaries of the park, the fence looming ahead like a barrier between them and freedom. But even as they neared the final gate, the sound of approaching vehicles cut through the air. The park had already mobilized. They weren't going to let Marcus and the others leave so easily. "Get ready," Marcus said, his voice filled with resolve. "This is our last stand." As Marcus and his allies ran toward the final stretch of the escape route, the park's security closed in on them. Shots were fired, but they were ready. They had prepared for this moment, and they wouldn't let anything stop them. With a final burst of energy, they broke through the gate, leaving the park and its control behind. They were no longer trapped. They were free. Hours later, as the sun began to rise, Marcus sat with his allies in a safe house far from the park. The data was in their hands, the conspiracy was out in the open, and the world was about to know the truth. Marcus exhaled deeply, feeling the weight of everything they had fought for. They had broken the cycle. They had taken down the system that had manipulated them for so long. But even as he stared out into the horizon, he knew that the fight wasn't over. The system was vast, and there were others like him, others who needed to know they weren't alone. The war wasn't just about escaping anymore. It was about exposing the truth, about showing the world what had been hidden in the shadows for so long. And Marcus would make sure the world knew the truth, no matter the cost. Marcus stood alone in the quiet aftermath of the storm. The sun had long since set, casting the world in a veil of darkness, but the brightness of his victory, of exposing the truth, had not faded. His hands still shook, but not from fear. It was from the weight of the cost, the burden of everything he had sacrificed to bring the conspiracy into the light. The world now knew the truth about the experiment, the manipulation, the way those in power had used and abused the vulnerable. The military, the government, and the agencies responsible for the psychological warfare program had been exposed. News outlets were flooding with reports, interviews, and shocking revelations about the hidden experiments that spanned far beyond the park where Marcus had once been a mere pawn. But as Marcus sat in the dimly lit room, surrounded by the quiet hum of the world moving on, he couldn't escape the feeling that something was still wrong. Even with the truth out there, something gnawed at him. The cost of what he had done was far deeper than he had anticipated. He had lost everything: his job, his life as he had once known it, and the sense of control he thought he had over his own fate. He had been manipulated, not just by the system, but by his own desire for freedom. He had fought to escape, to tear down the walls that had held him captive. But in doing so, he had severed his connections to the people who had once cared for him. His relationships had been fractured, his future uncertain. The battle wasn't over, but the personal cost was clear. His name was now in the public eye, both a hero and a villain in the eyes of the world. The truth was no longer a secret, but the emotional scars that had been left behind still haunted him. As the days passed, Marcus found himself on the run, not from the park or the people who had manipulated him, but from his own thoughts. The truth had been exposed, yes, but the questions it raised seemed endless. What would happen to the others? The test subjects who had been left behind, still caught in the web of control. What about the rangers who had taken part in the experiment without knowing the truth? Marcus had succeeded in one thing. He had shattered the illusion of power that had controlled them. But in the process, he had also found himself standing on the precipice of an uncertain future. Could he go back to his old life? Could he ever find peace after everything he had been through? The messages had started flooding in: calls from journalists, requests for interviews, offers of protection, and even threats. His name had become synonymous with the exposé, but at what cost? He was constantly moving, hiding in the shadows, just one step ahead of those who had the resources to silence him. The truth had set him free, but it had also condemned him to a life of uncertainty. Despite the chaos, Marcus couldn't shake the questions that lingered in his mind. The conspiracy may have been exposed, but the systems of power were far from gone. In fact, it was only now that he began to see the full scope of the problem. What if the experiment was just the tip of the iceberg? What if the manipulation and psychological warfare were already being applied to others, beyond the rangers and soldiers? He had glimpsed the machinery of control, but how deep did it go? Who else was pulling the strings behind the scenes? And more importantly, why? It wasn't just about psychological control anymore. It wasn't about military experiments or manipulation. It was about something much darker. It was about power and how far those who held it were willing to go to maintain it. Marcus had no answers, just more questions, and a world that was more fractured than he had ever imagined. The truth was out there, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a door that had been opened to a world full of even more terrifying questions. As he looked out at the horizon, the quiet of the wilderness around him, Marcus knew that the fight was far from over. The people who had manipulated him, who had used his own mind against him, weren't going to let him walk away easily. They would come for him, just like they had for the others who had dared to resist. But Marcus had made a choice. He wasn't going to run anymore. He had exposed the system, but there was still so much left to do. The system, the players behind it, and the people who had been broken by it, he wouldn't let their stories fade into silence. With a deep breath, Marcus stood up and walked out into the night. His future was uncertain, but it was his. The system that had manipulated him no longer held power over his decisions. For the first time in a long time, he was in control of his own fate. But the world around him was still broken. There were others, victims, who had suffered just like he had. And though he didn't know where his path would lead, Marcus was certain of one thing: he wouldn't let their story end like his. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning.